In the summer of 53 BC, the Roman Republic marched into the heart of Mesopotamia, 40,000 strong, convinced that no power on earth could withstand the legions that had conquered the world. At their head rode the wealthiest man in Rome, a general who had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus, a politician who believed gold and iron could buy him immortality. But waiting in the shimmering heat of the desert was something Rome had never faced before. 10,000 horsemen, no infantry, no walls, only speed, arrows, and a young general who had studied Roman tactics like scripture and now prepared to turn them into a death sentence. And when the two forces met on the burning plains near Carrhae, the world shattered. Drums thundered across the desert. A wall of dust rose on every horizon. Arrows fell like black rain from a cloudless sky. Men screamed. Shields splintered. The famous Roman formations broke apart under waves of attackers who struck and vanished, until the sand itself turned red. A son fell, his head raised on a Parthian spear for his father to see. And when the sun finally set, 20,000 Romans lay dead in the dust. And the empire that had conquered the Mediterranean discovered that the East would not bow so easily. This is the story of Rome's worst defeat since Hannibal. The story of ambition that crossed a desert and never returned. The story of Carrhae, where the legions met the horse archers, and the horse archers won. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic had transformed from a small city-state into the dominant power of the ancient world. Its legions had crushed Carthage in the west, subdued the Greek kingdoms in the east, and pushed the borders of Roman influence from the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of the Black Sea. The Mediterranean had become a Roman lake. Kings sent tribute. Cities opened their gates. And in the marble halls of the Senate, men spoke of Rome as if it were destiny itself made flesh. Yet beyond the familiar boundaries of Roman power lay a world that still resisted. To the east, past Syria and the Euphrates River, stretched the vast Parthian Empire. Born from the ashes of Alexander's conquests, Parthia controlled the great trade routes between Rome and the riches of India and China. Its capital at Ctesiphon glittered with gold brought from distant lands. Its horsemen were legendary, raised in the saddle from childhood, masters of the bow and the lance. For decades, Rome and Parthia had maintained an uneasy peace, watching each other across the desert frontier like two predators circling the same prey. But peace, in Rome, was never permanent. The Republic was ruled not by one man, but by ambition itself, and in those turbulent years, 3 men had risen to dominate Roman politics. Gaius Julius Caesar was conquering Gaul, writing his name across the map of Europe in blood and fire. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and reorganized the East, his military reputation towering over all rivals. And then there was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the 3rd member of their informal alliance, the man they called the first triumvirate's moneylender. Crassus was not like the others. He had never led armies to distant frontiers. His power came not from military glory, but from gold. He was perhaps the wealthiest man in Roman history, his fortune built on real estate speculation, slave trading, and the ruthless acquisition of property during civil strife. He owned silver mines. He owned apartment buildings. He owned fire brigades that would arrive at burning homes only after the owners agreed to sell at ruinous prices. Romans joked that Crassus could fund entire wars from his personal treasury. They were not exaggerating, yet, for all his wealth, Crassus carried a wound that gold could not heal. He craved military glory, the one currency his rivals possessed and he lacked. He had commanded legions before, most famously crushing the slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 71 BC. But that victory had been stolen from him by Pompey, who arrived at the last moment to claim the triumph. The humiliation burned in Crassus for decades. He watched as Caesar conquered nation after nation in Gaul. He watched as Pompey basked in the adoration of Rome, and he grew old. His military reputation forever stained by the shadow of men who seemed born for war. By 55 BC, Crassus had decided that he would wait no longer. He was 60 years old, his health declining, his legacy uncertain. If he was to match his rivals, he needed a conquest of his own, something grand enough to eclipse them both. His eyes turned east toward Parthia. The reports he received were encouraging. Parthia was rich beyond imagination. Its army relied on cavalry, and everyone knew that cavalry could not stand against Roman infantry. Other eastern kingdoms had fallen easily enough. Why should Parthia be different? The Senate granted Crassus the governorship of Syria, and with it, the permission to wage war as he saw fit. In November of 55 BC, he left Rome at the head of 7 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, along with cavalry and auxiliary troops. The streets were lined with crowds, some cheering, others silent with foreboding. A tribune named Attius Capito stood at the city gates and cursed the expedition publicly, calling down the wrath of the gods upon anyone who marched to make war without just cause. Crassus ignored him. He believed that gold would buy him victory as easily as it had bought him everything else. He was wrong. Marcus Licinius Crassus arrived in Syria in the spring of 54 BC, and from the first moment, his campaign revealed the flaws that would destroy it. Rather than marching immediately into Parthian territory, he spent time consolidating Roman positions along the Euphrates, capturing minor cities, and loading his wagons with plunder. He seemed more interested in enriching himself than in defeating the enemy. His soldiers watched as he stripped temples of their gold and diverted military resources to fill his personal coffers. The discipline of the legions began to fray. Worse still, Crassus rejected the advice of men who knew the region better than he did. King Artavasdes II of Armenia offered to provide 40,000 auxiliary troops and suggested that Crassus invade Parthia through the Armenian highlands. The mountainous terrain would neutralize the Parthian cavalry advantage and provide the Romans with friendly bases and secure supply lines. It was sound military counsel. Crassus refused. He preferred the direct route through the Mesopotamian desert, believing that speed would bring him to the wealthy Parthian cities before the enemy could react. He did not understand that the desert itself was a weapon, that the open plains would expose his infantry to exactly the kind of warfare the Parthians had perfected over centuries. Pride blinded him, impatience drove him, and the decision sealed his fate. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Parthian Empire, King Orodes II received word of the Roman invasion. He was a cautious ruler, newly secure on his throne after a brutal civil war with his brother. He divided his forces carefully. The main army he led personally into Armenia to punish Artavasdes for his alliance with Rome and to prevent any attack from the north. The rest of his cavalry, a smaller force of perhaps 10,000 horsemen, he entrusted to a young nobleman named Surena. Surena was extraordinary. At barely 30 years old, he had already proven himself the finest general in Parthia. He came from one of the great noble families, the Surin, whose wealth rivaled that of kings. His personal household included 1,000 armored horsemen, his retainers and bondsmen, who would follow him into death itself. He dressed in the Median fashion, with painted face and elaborately styled hair, and enemies who saw his beauty often underestimated the brilliance behind it. But Surena was no mere aristocrat playing at war. He had studied Roman tactics meticulously, learning their strengths and their weaknesses. He understood that the legion was devastating in close combat, but vulnerable at range. He knew that Roman discipline depended on formation, and that anything which disrupted that formation would turn strength into chaos. He designed his entire campaign around a single insight. Never let the Romans fight the battle they wanted. His force was small, but perfectly suited to its purpose. 1,000 cataphracts formed the heavy cavalry. Warriors encased in scale armor from head to knee, their horses likewise armored, carrying lances 12 feet long that could punch through shields and men alike. The remaining 9,000 were horse archers, lightly armored riders mounted on swift Arabian horses, carrying the deadly composite bow that had made Parthian warriors famous across Asia. Behind them rolled a supply train of 1,000 camels, each loaded with arrows. The Parthians would not run out of ammunition. The Romans would run out of men. Surena did not intend to defeat Crassus in a single battle. He intended to destroy him slowly, to bleed his army until nothing remained but corpses and captured standards. And as the Roman legions marched deeper into the desert in the spring of 53 BC, The trap was already closing around them. The final march began in June of 53 BC. Crassus crossed the Euphrates at Zogma with approximately 35,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, leaving garrisons behind to hold the river crossings. The land before him stretched flat and featureless, a sea of dust and scrub, broken only by the occasional dry riverbed. The heat was murderous. Water was scarce. The Romans were accustomed to the gentle hills of Italy, to the forests of Gaul, to terrain where infantry could dictate the terms of battle. This was something else entirely. A local chieftain named Ariamnes offered to guide the army. He claimed to know shortcuts through the desert, paths that would bring them quickly to the wealthy cities of Parthia. Crassus trusted him. He should not have. Ariamnes was in Parthian pay, and he led the Romans deliberately away from the Euphrates, away from water and shade, into the heart of the burning plain, where cavalry would reign supreme. Day after day, the legions marched through emptiness. The sand got into everything. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Horses died. The supply wagons fell behind. And always, on the horizon, Roman scouts reported movement. Parthian riders watching, waiting, but never engaging. The soldiers grew nervous. Something was wrong, but no one could say what. On the 9th of June, near the town of Carrhae, the scouts came racing back with terrifying news. The Parthian army had been found. It was not retreating. It was coming straight toward them. Crassus ordered his men into formation. The legions had trained for this moment their entire lives. Heavy infantry formed the center, shields locked, javelins ready, short swords waiting for the close combat, where Roman discipline would crush any enemy. Light infantry and cavalry protected the flanks. The formation was solid, professional, exactly what Roman military doctrine prescribed. But the enemy did not cooperate. The Parthians appeared on the horizon like a mirage, dust clouds rising behind them, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth. At first, the Romans could see only a small vanguard. Surena had ordered his men to cover their armor with cloths and cloaks, concealing the true strength of his force. Then, at a signal, the cloths fell away. The Romans saw a wall of iron and fire, cataphracts gleaming in the sunlight, their armor scales flashing like dragon skin, horse archers by the thousands spreading across the plain like floodwater. And from the Parthian lines came a sound that froze Roman blood. Drums, hundreds of massive kettle drums, beaten in unison, producing a roar that shook the ground and drowned out all thought. The sound was designed not to signal but to terrify, and it worked. The first arrows fell before the Romans could react. The Parthian horse archers did not charge, they circled. Riding in loose formations around the Roman square, they loosed arrows from a distance no pilum could reach. The composite bow was devastatingly effective. Constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it stored more energy than any weapon the Romans had encountered. And in the hands of mounted archers, trained from childhood, it became an instrument of annihilation. The arrows punched through shields, they pierced armor. They found the gaps between helmet and breastplate, between greave and sandal. Men fell screaming, clutching at shafts that seemed to sprout from their bodies like weeds. And when the legionaries tried to advance, to close the distance and engage in the hand-to-hand combat they craved, the horse archers simply retreated, wheeling their mounts with effortless grace, firing backward over their shoulders in the famous Parthian shot that would give its name to a phrase still used 2,000 years later. Crassus watched his men die and did nothing. He could not order a charge because the enemy would not stay and fight. He could not retreat because the Parthians would harry his columns to destruction. He could only wait, hoping that the enemy would eventually run out of arrows. They did not. Surena had planned for everything. As the first riders exhausted their quivers, they rode back to the camel train and returned with fresh ammunition. The arrow storm continued without pause, hour after hour, until the sand around the Roman formation was carpeted with shafts, and the groans of the wounded merged into a single, endless howl. Desperate to break the deadlock, Crassus sent his son Publius with a force of 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of infantry to drive off the horse archers. It was exactly what Surena wanted. The Parthians feigned retreat, drawing Publius away from the main army across the plain until his force was isolated and exhausted. Then, the trap closed. The cataphracts appeared as if from nowhere, a wall of armored horsemen that slammed into the Roman cavalry with devastating force. The Gallic riders, though brave, could not penetrate the Parthian armor. Their swords glanced off scale and mail. Their horses, smaller and less heavily built, were overmatched. Meanwhile, the horse archers circled behind, pouring arrows into the Roman infantry until the men could not raise their arms to fight. Publius saw his force being annihilated around him. Rather than be captured, he ordered his shield-bearer to kill him. The young man obeyed. Publius Crassus died at 25, his dreams of glory ending in the blood-soaked dust of Mesopotamia. The Parthians cut off his head and fixed it to the point of a spear. The sight broke Marcus Crassus. When the Parthian cavalry approached his main force again, waving his son's head before him, something shattered inside the old general. He withdrew into himself, refusing to give orders, refusing to speak. His officers had to take command, organizing the defense, while their commander sat paralyzed by grief and horror. The battle continued until nightfall, the arrows falling without mercy, the Roman formation shrinking as men died or collapsed from wounds and exhaustion. When darkness finally came, the Parthians withdrew. They did not fight at night, but they knew the battle was already won. The Romans spent that night in hell. Without water, without medical supplies, surrounded by thousands of wounded men whose cries echoed across the plain, they could only wait for dawn and the resumption of slaughter. Crassus remained unreachable, lost in a private agony that had swallowed his mind. His officers made the only decision they could. Under cover of darkness, the army would retreat to Carrhae, abandoning the wounded to Parthian mercy. They knew what that mercy would look like. At first light, the Parthians would kill every man left behind. The retreat was chaos. Columns fragmented in the darkness. Units became lost. 4 entire cohorts wandered into a marsh and were surrounded at dawn, annihilated to the last man. Those who reached Carrhae found temporary safety behind its walls, but safety was an illusion. The Parthians had not even begun their pursuit. In the days that followed, the trap continued to tighten. Crassus led what remained of his army northward, hoping to reach the mountains of Armenia, where the Parthian cavalry could not follow. But Surena was always one step ahead, blocking the paths, harrying the columns, offering false guides who led the Romans into ambushes. Finally, Surena sent word that he wished to negotiate. He offered Crassus safe passage in exchange for a treaty. The Roman officers did not trust the offer, but their men were on the verge of mutiny. They demanded that their commander meet with the Parthians. Crassus, broken and exhausted, agreed. The meeting was a trap. When Crassus rode out with a small escort, a scuffle broke out. The accounts differ on exactly what happened, but the result was clear. Marcus Licinius Crassus, triumvir of Rome, victor over Spartacus, richest man in the ancient world, was killed in a nameless skirmish in the desert he had tried to conquer. The stories that followed added their own cruel poetry. Some said the Parthians cut off his head and sent it to King Orodes, who was celebrating a wedding in Armenia. The head arrived during a performance of Euripides' Bacchae, and an actor grabbed it to use as a prop, reciting lines about the head of Pentheus, while the court roared with laughter. Other stories claimed that the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat after death, a final mockery of the greed that had driven him to destruction. Whether true or legend, the symbolism was perfect. He had crossed the world for gold. Now gold would fill his mouth forever. Of the 40,000 Romans who had crossed the Euphrates, 20,000 were dead. 10,000 more had been captured, destined for slavery in the distant reaches of Parthia. Only 10,000 escaped, struggling back to Syria under the command of Gaius Cassius Longinus, the quaestor whose warnings Crassus had ignored. That same Cassius would later help assassinate Julius Caesar, but that was another story, another tragedy waiting to unfold. The eagles were lost. The sacred standards of the legions, symbols of Roman power and divine favor, had been captured by the Parthians. For Rome, there could be no greater humiliation. The eagles would not be recovered for 33 years until Augustus negotiated their return through diplomacy rather than force. Even then, the shame of Carrhae lingered. For Surena, victory brought no reward. King Orodes, jealous of his general's fame, had him executed within the year. The man who had destroyed a Roman army and humiliated the greatest power of the ancient world died at the hands of his own king, his brilliance too dangerous to tolerate. And for Rome itself, Carrhae changed everything. The death of Crassus destroyed the balance of the first triumvirate. Without him as mediator, the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey spiraled into civil war. That war would end the Republic and birth the Empire, transforming Rome into something its founders would not have recognized. The Battle of Carrhae echoed through the centuries. It taught Rome that the East could not be conquered by will alone, that there were limits even to the power of the legions. It demonstrated that mobility and ranged warfare could defeat the finest heavy infantry the ancient world had ever produced. And it reminded the conquerors that pride, unchecked by wisdom, leads inevitably to destruction. Today, the plains near Carrhae lie silent. The desert has reclaimed the bones. No monument marks the place where 20,000 men died for one man's ambition. But the lesson remains, written in the dust of Mesopotamia, whispered by the wind that still blows across the empty land. Empires rise on confidence, they fall on arrogance, and the desert, in the end, keeps what it takes.